I was 22 at a Halloween party hosted by my old best friend Chris. This was back when Chris was still around before he passed away in 2013. Halloween had always been his thing. He'd throw these massive parties at his house every year because his parents would always leave for their own getaway to New York. He was obsessed with Halloween. His house was packed with all sorts of crazy decorations. He had creepy props everywhere, some so terrifying that we knew he spent way too much money on them. Every year, he would even set up elaborate haunted mazes in the house by covering walls with cardboard and eerie wallpaper. I won't get into the details of the party, no need to talk about the substances or anything else, but things took a turn for the worse later in the night. We weren't exactly sober, but none of us expected what was coming. Chris, a few of my other friends, Mark, Dave, and Luke, and I were in Chris's room, passing around a bong, when we heard loud bangs from downstairs. Chris, looking panicked, rushed to the door to see what was going on. Then we heard the screams from both guys and girls, like people were fighting for their lives. It was clear something was terribly wrong. We yelled at Chris to get back in and lock the door. Even though we were all a little out of it, we knew we needed to hide. Chris quickly shut the door and locked it. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. We asked him what had happened, but he just looked at us, motioning for us to stay quiet. We all knew the situation had escalated badly, so we didn't ask any more questions. Chris turned off the lights and we scattered to hide. He hid in the closet with Mark while I crawled under the bed with Luke, and Dave took refuge in a nearby storage box. We could hear the music from downstairs stop abruptly, followed by a man's deep voice, yelling at everyone to quiet down. A girl screamed, and another round of bangs followed. Silence hung in the air for a moment. Then more shouting, more chaos. By that time, we knew for sure there were intruders in the house. At least 3, maybe more, but we couldn't be certain. We heard the distinct sound of boots pounding up the stairs, then stopping right outside Chris's room. The intruder tried the door handle, but quickly realized it was locked. Then came the violent ramming of the door, the sound of someone throwing themselves into it. After several failed attempts, we heard a few loud shots. The lock gave way, and the door swung open. From beneath the bed, I watched as heavy boots and torn denim jeans appeared in the doorway. One of the intruders stepped into the room, heading straight for the closet. I could hear Chris's voice trembling as he pleaded for his life, offering money, anything to make them leave. But the intruder wasn't interested. He demanded Chris come downstairs. We stayed hidden, not daring to move. There was silence for what felt like an eternity, only broken by the occasional low murmur of the intruders. And Chris, I couldn't make out much, but I knew something terrible was happening. It felt like ages before we heard the front door slam shut, and Chris came rushing back upstairs, his face a mix of relief and horror. When I stepped downstairs later, I saw 2 bodies lying motionless. On the living room floor, it was Chris's close friends, Jake and Ben. They were gone, killed in the chaos. I won't go into the gruesome details, but it's a memory that stays with me to this day. The police arrived, and despite the heavy smell of smoke and the mess everywhere, they were focused on one thing. Who were the masked men responsible for the deaths? Chris later told us there had been 4 intruders, all wearing fedoras, face masks, and gloves. They demanded a huge sum of money, and when Chris couldn't provide it, they forced him to empty out everything of value in the house. They even made the partygoers contribute, taking wallets and threatening to kill anyone who resisted. After that night, everything changed for Chris. He fell into a deep depression, drank heavily, and stopped going to school. He started using harder drugs, meth and heroin, and he never seemed to get better. One evening, I sat with him, and he opened up in a way he never had before, with tears in his eyes and a pipe in his hand. He told me how much pain he was in, not just from the drugs, but from the guilt. He believed it was his fault his friends were dead. Just under a year later, in July of 2013, Chris overdosed on heroin. He was gone, and nothing could bring him back. It was my first Halloween living in my own house, away from my parents. The house was a small corner property with a basement, but no upstairs, a place my parents helped me buy. It was 11 p.m., and I was watching a horror movie marathon when I heard a knock at the door. At first I was confused. Who could be knocking this late? I figured it was probably just some late-night pranksters, so I ignored it and went back to my movie. But then the knocking came again, this time louder. Annoyed, I shouted from my seat, "Go away!" I wasn't in the mood for pranks. But they didn't stop. The knocks turned into a steady pounding. I jumped up, angry now, and flung open the door. But when I looked outside, no one was there. I quickly slipped on my shoes and went outside, checking the bushes, my car, the street, nothing, no one in sight. Frustrated, I went back inside, locked the door, and even locked my bedroom door just to be safe. Despite the TV blaring, I could still hear the pounding on the door. It went on for what felt like forever, over 30 minutes. I figured they were probably filming something for YouTube and wanted a reaction, but I wasn't going to give them that. I must have dozed off because when I woke up, the clock read 2 a.m. The knocking was still going on, but then something strange happened. The knocking wasn't at the front door anymore, it was at my bedroom door. My heart stopped. I jumped out of bed, looking frantically for something to defend myself with. They knew I was awake. They were trying the doorknob, trying to break in. In a panic, I quickly thought of something. It wasn't much, but it was all I could do. I grabbed my speaker, connected my phone, and found a gunshot sound effect on YouTube. I cranked the volume and pressed play. The sound of a gunshot filled the room. I paused the video after the first shot and yelled, "That's a warning shot! Leave now or I'll shoot!" I heard footsteps quickly retreating, followed by the sound of the front door slamming. I waited a few moments before cautiously opening my bedroom door. They were gone, but the front door was wide open. I rushed to shut it, lock it, and immediately called the police. That was the last I heard of the pranksters, and thankfully, that was the end of my night. Halloween wasn't something I ever really got excited about growing up. I didn't have many friends, and by the time I was 10, I couldn't use the excuse of going with my mom anymore, since I didn't have anyone to go with. But this past Halloween, when I turned 14, things were different. My mom took my little sister, who was 8, out trick-or-treating, and I stayed behind to hand out candy. Honestly, I was kind of excited. It felt like I had a job to do, and I wasn't just the lonely kid at home anymore. Mom left around 6 p.m. and told me she'd be back around 9. I was enjoying the peace and quiet, watching scary movies, answering the door for the occasional trick-or-treater. Then the phone rang. The loud noise startled me, but when I picked it up, no one spoke. I heard muffled sounds, like someone holding the phone but not saying anything. After a few seconds of silence, they hung up. I just figured it was a prank call, probably for Halloween. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. Same unknown number. I picked it up. This time, I heard faint breathing on the other end. I frowned, thinking it was my friend Steve messing around. "Okay, Steve. Very funny," I said. The call ended without a word. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I didn't think much of it. Not long after, the phone rang again. By then, it was getting late, and the doorbell was ringing less and less. I answered the phone, but this time, all I could hear was breathing again. followed by the faint sound of the phone being shuffled around. Then, in a low, exaggerated voice, the person said, "I'll be paying you a visit tonight." I was done. I was annoyed and a little scared, so I hung up and promised myself I wouldn't answer the phone again. About 30 minutes later, the power went out. The lights flickered, the TV turned off, and the house was plunged into darkness. I froze, my heart racing, as I heard loud, angry thumping at the front door. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Laughter. I recognized it immediately. I threw open the door, and there was my friend Steve, standing on the porch. I shoved him away from the door in frustration. "So that was you making those creepy phone calls?" I demanded. He laughed and nodded. "That didn't sound like you on the phone," I said. He looked confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. I was furious, but then my stomach dropped. I had Steve follow me outside to check the fuse box. Sure enough, the box had been tampered with and all the wires had been cut. I don't think I've ever run faster in my life. As we dashed back inside the house, I called my mom, who told us to stay inside while she contacted the police. The authorities traced the call to a payphone outside a nearby bar. To this day, I don't know if it was just a Halloween prank gone too far, or if something much worse was about to happen. Either way, I don't think I ever want to find out. When I was younger, my friends and I went trick-or-treating every year. One particular Halloween, we had an experience that I'll never forget. We were walking down the street when we passed a man standing completely still, holding a lantern and wearing a mask. It was odd, but we didn't think much of it at first. As we walked away, we looked back and noticed that he had turned his entire body to watch us with his eyes. We were creeped out, but since there were plenty of people around, we continued on to the next house. As we went from house to house, we kept seeing him again and again, always in the distance, but getting closer each time. It was like he was following us, and no matter how fast we walked, he seemed to keep pace. At one point, we hadn't seen him for a while, so we relaxed a bit while we got candy from a house. But when we turned around to walk back toward the street, there he was, standing right in the middle of the road, waiting for us. We rushed back to the door we'd just knocked on and told the owners about the man. The man continued walking down the street, and thankfully, we didn't see him again that night. Later, an adult friend of the family told us he had seen a masked man hiding behind a tree earlier, waving little kids over. The man only backed off when he threatened to call the police. A few years later, on another Halloween, I was out trick-or-treating with my friend Casey, who was 11, like me. We were crossing a small wooden bridge over a river called Jack Winkle River when a black Jeep suddenly pulled up on the other side, blocking the way. We froze, then quickly turned around and started walking away. We were always taught to obey the stranger danger rules. We heard the windows of the Jeep roll down, and a man with a raspy smoker's voice called for us to come back, asking us for directions. We yelled, "Sorry," and picked up the pace, but the Jeep couldn't fit on the bridge and drove down the road. We thought we were safe, but then an SUV appeared, barreling around the corner and slamming on the brakes right in front of us. The windows rolled down again, and we saw two older men in the car, one with gray curly hair and a mustache. The man in the back seat spoke in the same raspy voice, telling us to get in the car because they had free bags of candy. At that point, the Jeep made a 3-point turn and began following us. The SUV came to a stop and the front and back doors swung open. The two men lunged toward us. We dropped our candy bags and ran as fast as we could, straight for my house, which we could see in the distance. We rang the doorbell desperately at least 20 times before my mom finally opened the door. We screamed and pointed at the Jeep that was backing away down the street. She quickly pulled us inside, locked the door, and called the police. She was frantic, worried that the men now knew where we lived. My dad tried to calm her down, but it was clear that she couldn't settle. The police decided to send an unmarked car to patrol our street for 3 hours. That gave my mom a little comfort, but what really made us feel better was when my dad woke us up in the middle of the night to show us the flashing red and blue lights outside. The unmarked police car had pulled over an SUV and a black Jeep, and 3 men were in cuffs. Those were the same creepy men who had tried to kidnap us. My dad went outside to talk to the officer and most likely confirmed the identities of the men. Me and Casey, still shaken, went to the doorway and screamed at the men, giving them the finger. My mom pulled us back inside and shut the door, sending us to bed. What started as the worst night of our lives turned into the best night, knowing that the men who had terrified us were behind bars. It was Halloween night, and after a fun evening of trick-or-treating with my 7-year-old daughter, Jamie, we came home, had dinner, and settled in to watch some TV. When it was time for bed, Jamie seemed a little uneasy. So I tucked her in and made sure everything was okay. A few minutes later, she came running back into my room, whispering that she thought someone was in her closet. I reassured her, telling her she was safe and that there was nothing to worry about. Reluctantly, she went back to her room, but I told myself that if she came back again, I would show her there was nothing in the closet. Sure enough, 5 minutes later, she was back. This time, she said she heard things moving in the closet. My heart skipped a beat. Trying to stay calm, I walked her to her room, turned on the lights, and joked, "Is anyone in there?" We stood still, listening, and then we heard it. A loud thud from inside the closet. Panic set in. I shouted, "Run to the neighbor's house and call the police!" As I rushed to open the door, to my shock, there was Randy, the neighbor's son, sitting on top of Jamie's Lego box. I grabbed him by the collar, yanked him up, and stormed back to his parents' house. I found Jamie already ringing their doorbell, and when they answered, I shoved Randy inside, explaining everything. I told his father that I wouldn't press charges, but if I ever caught him near my daughter again, they'd regret it. Randy's dad slapped him hard and then invited me inside to hear his explanation. Apparently, while we were out, Randy had sneaked into our house through an open window, and his friend Daryl had joined him in hiding in Jamie's closet. I was furious. I told Jamie to stay with Randy's dad while I went back inside to check the house. That's when I found Daryl, uglier, shadier, and holding Jamie's underwear. Without thinking, I grabbed him by the throat, threw him to the floor, and slapped him several times. I didn't call the police, partly because of my friendship with Mark, Randy's dad, but I made it clear that if either of them ever came near my daughter again, they would regret it. The next morning, I found a small drill hole in Jamie's closet door. They had been spying on her while she slept. To this day, I regret not calling the police, but nothing has happened since. Jamie's 13 now, and Randy's gone off to college. We had just moved into our large new home in Mississauga, Ontario, located in an area called Winston Churchill. It was Halloween night, and my parents, my 4 sisters, my brother, and I were busy unpacking our things into our new bedrooms. The excitement of moving was mixed with sadness about leaving our old friends behind. My mom called us to do some chores, and although it was late, around 11:30 p.m., I helped out, too tired to argue. Once the chores were done, I went to bed, but I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps upstairs. Thinking it was one of my siblings, I got up to yell at them for disturbing me. But when I checked, there was no one around. I went to the basement to check with my parents and siblings, but everyone was still busy working. I shrugged it off as my imagination and went back to bed. Later, around 12:30 a.m., when everyone else had gone to sleep, I heard loud banging coming from my parents' bedroom. I thought maybe it was one of my siblings, but when I didn't hear any more sounds, I decided to check it out. When I walked down the hallway, everything went silent. There was no one in the hallway, but the banging started again, louder this time. I was too scared to sleep. But just as I lay there, trying to calm myself, the door to my room creaked open. A shadowy figure stood next to my bed. At first, I thought it was one of my sisters. But when I looked over, I saw a tall figure, easily 7 feet tall, standing silently beside me. Frozen with fear, I couldn't even scream. Then, the figure whispered, "Boo!" That was enough to break my paralysis, and I screamed, covering my eyes. My parents rushed in, turning on the lights, but when they looked, there was no one there. I told them everything. The knocking, the figure, but they didn't hear anything. They all thought I was just imagining things. But I knew I wasn't. The horror I felt that night was real, and I'll never forget it. It was Halloween night, and my friends and I, all 20 years old, decided to check out a haunted house attraction called Scarehouse Journey to the Basement. It was only open for 4 years in our town, and this was its final year. The attraction was a maze-style haunted house where you had to find a key and unlock the basement door to escape. The rooms were beautifully creepy, filled with antique furniture, bloodstains, and webs. We navigated the maze for what felt like hours, getting spooked by actors in horrifying costumes. After much exploration, we finally reached the basement. The moment we descended into the pitch-black darkness, the atmosphere changed. It was so dark we could barely see, and the eerie creaking of the floorboards made every step feel like it could be our last. As we stumbled through the darkness, one of my friends accidentally bumped into someone, and when we asked who it was, there was no response. The stranger placed a hand on my shoulder, and I bolted, screaming. We found a key in the corner of the room and scrambled back upstairs, but the scariest part was yet to come. As we exited the haunted house, we noticed a tall person in a black robe and pig mask standing outside. At first, we thought it was part of the attraction, but as we walked away, he began following us. We tried to joke it off at first, but the guy wouldn't stop. We ran to my friend Eddie's house, hoping to get away from him. When we reached the backyard, the man followed us, walking faster now. Eddie's dad emerged with a gun and threatened the man, who immediately stopped and raised his hands, pleading not to be shot. The man claimed he was just an employee, but when we contacted the haunted house later, they had no record of anyone in a pig mask. To this day, we don't know who that person was or why he followed us.